Hello, I'm Alexander. I have a new original story for you. Enjoy watching.
They dragged me in front of the brazier to teach the kingdom a lesson. That was what they called it, when the ash maids were made to stand in the heat and watch someone die. I had been shoved from the service passage into the fire court, with soot still streaking my cheek, my hands trembling around an empty tray, my apron gray with cinders from the furnace rooms below. The square was already packed with nobles, soldiers, and market folk who had come for entertainment, dressed up as justice. Above them all, chained to a black iron pillar set into the pit, was the Fire King. He looked less like a man than a punishment that had learned to breathe. His wrists were locked in rune cuffs, his throat ringed with scorch marks, and his bare skin was split in places where the flame inside him had broken through and then died back into a red, angry glow. Even seated, even bound, he seemed too large for the world to hold. Heat shimmered around him in thick waves. Every breath he took came out in a low crackle, as if his lungs were full of embers. Someone in the crowd shouted that the cursed king should be fed to his own fire. Someone else laughed. Then the captain of the ash ward grabbed my shoulder and hurled me forward. "Here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The little soot girl will have a last look at the monster she's serving. Maybe she'll learn why we warn children not to pity the burning." The crowd chuckled at that. A few women covered their smiles with gloved hands. I knew those faces. I had scrubbed the ash from their oven grates, carried coal to their baths, bowed in hallways, while they looked through me as if I were a stain that could speak. "Lift your head," the captain ordered. I did. The king was staring at me, not with surprise, not with pleading, with a terrible fixed stillness, as if he had already seen the shape of what I would choose before my own hands had decided. The overseer's whip cracked against the stone beside my feet. "Look at him properly, Maid. That is the one who burned half the western province. That is the thing that ate the rain and left us ash. If he asks for mercy, you give him none. If he begs, you laugh." My mouth had gone dry. The heat was unbearable. My whole body remembered what everyone said about the Fire King, that he had scorched armies, that he had turned riverbanks into glass, that no one who came close ever walked away unchanged. But what I saw in front of me was not a tyrant on a throne. It was a man chained upright so the court could spit on him safely, and his lips were split open. Blood darkened one corner of his mouth, and the skin there was so cracked it looked as if someone had tried to break him like kiln clay. One of his hands twitched against the rune cuffs. The chain answered with a hiss. The captain noticed my stare and barked a laugh. "You're soft already. Ash maids always are. They get used to cleaning what the rest of us throw away." Then he snapped his fingers, and a guard brought me a cup. Not a proper cup. A dented tin one, meant for animals or prisoners. The kind of thing they would have used to prove a point. He pushed it into my hands and shouted, so the whole square could hear, "Well, let's see if your little servant heart is brave enough to do the sensible thing. Pour it on the brazier. Show us how useless mercy is." The crowd leaned in. I could feel their hunger. They wanted me to obey the joke. They wanted me to throw water at the fire and be laughed at for it. They wanted the king to snarl, for the heat to flare, for something horrible and dramatic to happen, so they could go home, feeling righteous. I looked at the cup. then at the king's mouth. One line from my mother came back to me as clearly as if she were standing beside the brazier herself. When everyone is shouting, pay attention to what is suffering quietly. No one had said that in this court before. No one had ever cared what I remembered. The captain frowned. Well, my fingers tightened around the tin. The surface burned from the heat around us, but inside it, the water still trembled cold and clear. I should have poured it on the fire. I should have done as I was told. I should have laughed and looked away and remained invisible, because invisible girls lived longer in this kingdom. Instead, I took one step closer to the chained king. The overseer went still. The guards shifted. Even the crowd quieted, as if the whole square sensed the shape of a mistake about to happen. The king's eyes moved to the cup in my hands. For the first time, something like warning tightened in his face. He spoke with a voice ruined by smoke. "Do not." The word was rough and low, but it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like he was trying to save me. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the look in his eyes. Maybe it was the way he had not once begged. Maybe it was because every person in the square had already decided I was worth less than the water I carried. Maybe I was tired of being right, only when I was obedient. I raised the cup, and before the captain could seize me, before anyone could stop me, I pressed the rim to the Fire King's cracked lips and tipped the water into his mouth. The square went dead silent. Not a sound moved. Not a breath. Not even the braziers hissed. The king drank. Only a mouthful. Only enough to wet the blood at the corner of his lips. But the second the water touched him, the fire in his skin changed. It bowed. That is the only word I have for what happened. The flames that had been licking under his throat and crawling up his veins drew inward, not like fire starving, but like fire kneeling. A ring of heat spread outward from his body and then settled, lower, around him, as if some invisible power had recognized the cup in my hand and gone still in answer. The rune cuffs flashed white, the chains rattled. A gust of hot wind tore through the square and slammed a dozen banners hard against their poles. Someone screamed. Another person dropped to their knees. I froze with the cup still against his mouth, my heartbeat beating so loudly I could not hear anything else. The king's eyes were open on mine now, and in them I saw something impossible. Not rage, not shock, but recognition so sharp it looked painful. His hand lifted, not to strike, not to seize, to touch the side of the tin cup, as if he knew it from somewhere. Then the captain roared, "Enough! Pull her away from him!" Guards lunged. The cup was knocked from my fingers. Water splashed across the ash-stained stone. The instant it fell, the king's flames flared again, but instead of surging toward me, they wrapped around his own body like a shield. He turned his head and spoke one word that I felt more than heard. "Her." The guards stopped short. The captain's face drained of color. What did he say? The Fire King's gaze did not leave me. His voice came again, deeper now, as if the water had opened a door in him. "Do not touch her." The crowd erupted. That single sentence shattered the square. Some shouted that I had poisoned him. Some shouted that I had bewitched him. Some backed away, as if my shadow itself had become contagious. The nobles nearest the brazier recoiled, dragging their silks from the stone with fearful hands. I heard the overseer yelling for restraint, for judgment, for the second trial. because men like him always needed another law once the first one failed. And then the Fire King laughed. It was not a cruel sound. It was worse. It was the sound of a person hearing a joke only he understood. The flames along his collarbone bowed again, low and bright, before the chains snapped taut around his wrists. One of the guards swore and stumbled backward. Another crossed himself so fast he nearly struck his own eye. I stared at my empty hands. The water on the stones was already evaporating in pale threads. The captain recovered first. He pointed at me with his whip and screamed, "She's the one! She touched a cursed king without sanction! Seize her!" 2 guards seized my arms. Pain shot through my shoulders as they yanked me back from the brazier. My knees hit the stone hard enough to knock the breath from me. I tried to look at the king again, but the crowd had surged, and suddenly there were bodies everywhere, shouting over each other, all of them wanting a different version of what had just happened. Poison, spell work, stolen fire, witchcraft. An ash maid couldn't do that. She must have hidden something in the cup. Stolen fire. The word struck me with such force that, for one dizzy second, I forgot the guards holding me. Because that was not what I had done. I had carried water from the lower cistern, because the king looked as though he might crack open and burn from the inside, if no one helped him. I had done the one thing nobody in this kingdom ever expected an ash maid to do. I had chosen mercy over instruction. The overseer stormed toward me, his face purple with fury. Search her. Search her now. If she's used the royal water for a curse, we'll burn the truth out of her. The guards twisted my wrists behind my back. Wait, I said, though it came out barely above a breath. I didn't. A hard blow to my ribs cut off the rest, the square blurring around me. My eyes watered from pain and heat. Yet through all of it I saw the Fire King pull once against his chains, just once. Enough that the iron pillar groaned. Enough that every man in the square flinched. And enough that I understood something terrible and wonderful at the same time. He could have burned the court to ash if he wanted. He had not. He had not even looked at the people holding me. He had looked at me. One of the guards yanked my chin up so I would face the crowd. You're going to explain yourself, Ash girl, right now. But the king's voice cut across the square before I could answer. Leave her, he said. No one moved. His head was tilted slightly now, the black hair around his temples catching the light from the brazier. The flames around him had lowered, not gone out, but waiting. It was like standing near a storm that had chosen, for the moment, not to strike. The overseer swallowed. My lord, she has trespassed. She gave me water, the king said. His tone was so controlled it made the words more dangerous. She touched me, the overseer insisted, desperate now. That alone is forbidden. By law. By fear, the king said. The square shuddered at that. People stepped back. Even the soldiers looked unsure for the first time. The king's eyes lowered to me again. What is your name? He asked. The world seemed to tilt. No one in the court had asked me my name in years. Not when they ordered me. Not when they blamed me. Not when they shoved buckets into my hands and told me to clean after the feast. I could have cried at the sheer strangeness of being asked. The guards tightened their grip when I hesitated, as if they feared I might answer and make the moment worse. My name, I said. and the word felt rusty in my mouth. Is Era. Something passed through the Fire King's face then, quick, hidden. But I saw it, a flicker of pain, of memory, of recognition so exact it made my skin prickle. His pupils narrowed. The flames in the brazier dipped low, bowing toward him. That, more than anything, frightened the court. Not because he had smiled, not because he had raged, because his fire had answered. The captain found his voice again, and when he did, it came out shrill. This is proof. She's linked to him somehow. Take her below. Seal her in the ash cells until the priests decide if she's a curse or a thief. At once the guards pulled me toward the stairwell beneath the square. The stone under my knees scraped raw. I twisted to keep sight of the brazier, because some instinct told me not to let the king vanish from view. His chains rattled. His jaw tightened. For one unbearable second, it looked like he might speak again. Then the overseer slapped a command seal onto the iron stair rail, and a screen of heat and smoke rose between us. I was dragged down into darkness, with the taste of blood in my mouth, and the memory of his voice saying, "Leave her." The ash cells were below the old furnace tunnels, where the kingdom stored broken tools, condemned offerings, and people it preferred not to remember. They threw me into one of the smaller chambers, a room that smelled of damp soot and old fear, then slammed the gate shut. Only when the footsteps retreated did I curl around myself and try to breathe. My ribs hurt. My wrists burned where the ropes bit in. But that was not what kept my stomach hollow. It was the look in the king's eyes. He had looked at me like I was not a mistake, like he had been waiting for my face. Impossible. I was an ash maid. I slept on cinder pallets. I scrubbed cauldrons. I was the woman other servants blamed when silver went missing, and nobles wanted someone beneath them to insult. My life had been so small that I had learned to fold myself into corners without leaving a shadow. And yet the Fire King had said her. I pressed my forehead against my knees and tried not to tremble. The cell was quiet for a long time, except for the distant groan of the fortress above and the low roar of furnaces running somewhere deep in the mountain. Then, from beyond the iron door, I heard footsteps stop. A key turned. I jerked upright. The opening that appeared in the gate was too narrow to see through clearly, but I knew the silhouette at once. Broad shoulders, upright posture, no guard's clumsy weight, no priest's lazy shuffle. A man stood on the other side of my cell, and the air around him was warmer than it had any right to be. His voice came softly through the bars. "Era," he said, as if testing the shape of the name. My breath caught. The Fire King had come below the court, and in the dark, with all the shouting gone, he sounded less like a monster than like a man who had finally found the only door that had ever mattered. But before I could answer him, another voice rang out from the corridor behind him, cold, sharp, human. "Move away from the cell, Your Majesty." The king did not move. The new voice went on, pleased with itself. "We already know what the girl did. Now we only need to decide whether she acted alone, or whether someone in the ash levels has been feeding you in secret all this time." My stomach dropped, because if they were asking that question, then someone had seen more than the cup. And if someone had seen more than the cup, then my small, hidden life in the furnace halls was about to be torn open in front of everyone who had ever laughed at me. The king's shadow stretched over the cell gate. His next words were quiet enough that only I heard them. "Tell me," he said, "how many times have they made you kneel for them?" I stared at the slit in the door, too shaken to answer at first. No one in the fortress had ever asked me a question that sounded like it mattered. Kneel for them. The words landed harder than any slap. I could still feel the cold stone beneath my knees from the courtyard, still hear the laughter that had followed me when they pushed me forward with a cup in my hands and told me to spit in the Fire King's face if I wanted mercy. They had expected me to perform cruelty for their amusement. Instead, I had chosen the one thing they considered weaker than obedience: kindness. Now the king stood outside my cell door and asked how many times they had made me kneel. I swallowed. My throat felt scraped raw. "Enough," I whispered, because if I tried to count, I might have to remember every one. The silence that followed was almost worse than shouting. Then the cold voice behind him spoke again. "Your Majesty, step away from the prisoner." Prisoner. The word snapped the world back into its shape. Whatever strange pull had opened between us, the fortress had not forgotten who held the chains. A torch flared in the corridor, and I saw the figure standing beyond him. Lord Varek of the Ember Ledger, one of the court's ash ministers. He wore white gloves despite the soot, which meant he cared more about appearing untouched than about anything that burned. His face was narrow, his expression calm in the way knives are calm. Beside him stood 2 guards and a priest in red lacquered beads. All of them watched me as if I were a stain that had learned to speak. Varek smiled without warmth. "The girl has done enough damage for one night. She will be questioned for poisoning the king's mouth with foreign water. If she is lucky, she will be useful before dawn." My stomach tightened. Poisoning. So quickly they had twisted mercy into crime. The king's shoulders did not move, but the air around the gate warmed by a degree. "Open the cell," he said. Varek's brows lifted, as though he had heard a child ask for the moon. "You are in no condition to make demands." "I did not ask," the king replied. That voice. Low. Quiet. Certain. It made the torches tremble. The priest stepped forward, clutching his beads. "The old law forbids unsanctioned water before the brazier. If she touched you, then either she is cursed, or she is the hand of someone who means to unmake your seal." His seal. That was the first time I heard it said aloud in my presence. I looked from face to face, trying to understand why the word made the guards shift uneasily. I had scrubbed the floor under their boots for 3 years. I had emptied soot from the furnace grates. I had carried coal, cleaned chains, and learned how to disappear when nobles crossed the ash halls. No one had ever told me the king carried a seal, much less that water could harm it, unless they wanted me to believe that. The king's gaze moved to the priest. "Who taught you to fear water so much?" The priest went pale. Varek answered for him, still smiling. "The kind of lessons that keep kingdoms alive." Then he turned that smile on me. "You should have kept your hands to ash, Maid. You work in the furnace levels. You know your place. This sort of mercy is not for you." I flinched at the word maid, but I kept my voice steady. "He was thirsty." One of the guards barked a laugh. "Listen to her. She thinks the king needed charity." "I know he did," I said before I could stop myself. That made the corridor go still. Varek's eyes sharpened. "You know?" I hated the way he asked it, like the answer already belonged to him. The king's shadow cut across the cell bars, and I became aware that the warmth surrounding him was not the same as the violent blaze they had displayed in the courtyard. That fire had looked wild and hungry, a punishment given shape. This closeness felt different, controlled, contained by force, not by weakness. When she lifted a cup, the king said, the flames bent away from her hand. No one spoke. He continued, and now his voice held something thin and dangerous. That does not happen by accident. The priest made a quick sign over his chest. It means the girl bears soot-marked intent. She has either been touched by an outside flame or fed something into the king's breath. So we inspect her, Varek said smoothly. Search her cells. Search her pallet. Search the ash bucket she carries each morning. If she has been in contact with forbidden fire, we will find the residue. His certainty chilled me more than the stone under my feet, because I knew what the search would reveal. Not fire. Ash. My ash. Not from a single night, but from years of work. I had saved it in old spice jars under my pallet, because nobody cared enough to notice what I kept. When the furnaces burned too hot, I had sifted the pale residue and poured it into the broken seams at the base of the chamber walls. I told myself it was only habit, only tidiness, only the small dignity of leaving a place cleaner than I found it. Now the thought of those jars being opened made my pulse trip, because I remembered the patterns. The king was still watching me through the gate, and something in his expression changed when I looked away. Not pity, not impatience. Recognition sharpened by caution. You have been reading the ash, he said quietly. I looked up. What? He did not answer me. His eyes were fixed on my face, as if he had just heard a sound no one else could hear. Varek frowned. Reading? The king's jaw tightened. Open the cell. No, said Varek at once. Not until the inquest. The word inquest made the priest nod too quickly. A proper cleansing, Your Majesty. If she is innocent, the fire will show it. I almost laughed at that, though there was no humor in me. The fire would show what it always showed, what the powerful wanted it to show. The king's gaze dipped to my wrists, where rope had rubbed the skin red and raw. For one strange second, I thought he might speak to me directly again. But instead, he said to the corridor, You will not burn her for this. Varek folded his gloved hands. Then you are admitting she is important. That was a trap, and everyone knew it. Even I knew it. If the king denied me, they would drag me to the brazier as a liar and a thief. If he claimed me, they would call me his accomplice and make the punishment worse. The silence stretched. Then the king said, I am admitting that she gave me water. It was not a defense. It was not enough. But it was something, and the corridor reacted as if he had shattered a seal. The priest's face twisted. Then she has already contaminated the royal embers. By the law of the cradle fires, she must be isolated from the throne chambers until the council decides whether her touch has inverted his curse. Inverted his curse. There it was again. Another piece of a puzzle I had never been allowed to see. Varek made a small, satisfied sound. Then we move her to the furnace annex, under guard. She can watch the king from there if he insists on being sentimental. The king's hand curled against the bars. The metal hissed, not from heat alone. The iron itself shuddered as if the force in his grip had awakened something old in it. The guard stepped back involuntarily. My mouth went dry. That was not the same blaze from before. This was control on the edge of breaking. I did not know whether the king was protecting me or one breath away from shattering the gate and all the people behind it. Then he did something that made every person in the corridor blink. He lowered his head, just slightly, until his forehead nearly touched the bars between us. And in a voice too low for anyone else, he said, "Listen to me carefully. When they search your room, do not stop them from lifting the ash jars." I stared at him. "Why?" "Because what you saved is not just soot." I felt the blood drain from my hands. He continued, each word precise. "And because the first person who accuses you of poisoning me is the same one who helped poison me years ago." The corridor went utterly silent. Even the torches seemed to hold their breath. Varek's smile vanished. For the first time, his expression lost its polish and showed me something sharp and frightened underneath. I looked at him, then back at the king. "You know that?" The king's eyes did not leave Varek. "I know his scent," he said. That should have been impossible. The fire in his veins made him seem less human, more myth than man. Yet his voice was not grand. It was grim, familiar, like a scar finally naming the hand that made it. Varek recovered first. How dramatic. A prisoner, a maid, and a ghost story. "If you wish to accuse an ash minister, Your Majesty, you will need better than feelings and half-burned memories." Half-burned memories. The phrase struck the king like a spark. I saw it in the flicker of his eyes, in the sudden tightening of his mouth. Not rage, pain. And then I understood the shape of the room I had been standing in all my life. The furnace halls, the ash buckets. The way the older maids always told me to sweep in circles around the vents and never straight lines. The scraps of blackened wax I had found in the base of one wall and thought were old repairs. The strange, careful pattern of soot I had been brushing from the same places for years without knowing why. I had not been cleaning carelessly. I had been cleaning over messages. My breath caught. "The Ash Records things," I whispered. The king snapped his gaze to me so fast I almost flinched. Varek's brows drew together. "What did you say?" But I was already seeing it. The repeated smears around the furnace vents. The curved line near the east drain. The 3 marks above the lowest grate that I had always thought were scratches from tools. They were placed, not left. Deliberate, layered, hidden beneath years of soot. Someone had been using ash as a ledger, and I had been the one cleaning the page. My pulse began to hammer. "I've seen those patterns," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "All through the ash levels. I thought they were damage, but they repeat. They repeat in cycles." The priest looked horrified. "She's unstable." "I am not," I said, too fast, too sharply. Then I faced the king again. There were marks in the east furnace chamber, and in the corridor beneath the old cistern, and around the coal hatches where the servants say the wind never blows. I've cleaned them for years. Varek's face had gone pale beneath the soot powder at his hairline. The king's eyes narrowed. "Describe one." The room tightened around me. I had spent my life being ignored, but now the one man everyone feared was asking for my memory, as if it were evidence. I licked my lips. "A broken circle with a line through the center," I said, "and 3 ash dots beneath it. on the wall near the lower grate. The king went very still. A spark moved over his forearm, a bright thread of fire under scarred skin. Then, for the first time since I had met him, his expression broke into something like shock. "That was a warning seal," he said. Varek stepped back. "You don't know that." "I do," the king replied, and now his voice was hard enough to cut metal. "Because I placed it there." I stared at him. He had placed it there. Not long ago, perhaps. Or long before I was ever dragged into this palace. That meant the patterns I had swept for years were not random at all. They were instructions, markers, hidden witnesses in ash. A strange cold went through me. Not fear this time. Realization. I had not simply been overlooked. I had been standing inside a secret and not been told it existed. Varek recovered enough to sneer. And why would the king need secret warning seals in his furnace levels? Unless, of course, someone was smuggling messages through your girl's little cleaning rounds. His gaze snagged on me with ugly satisfaction. That would make her more than a maid, wouldn't it? It would make her a courier. The word courier was meant to dirty me, but it did something worse. It suggested intent where there had been only labor. It suggested that I had been used. Maybe I had. The thought sickened me, and before I could stop myself, I asked the question that had been burning since the courtyard. "Why did you know my name?" The king's eyes moved back to mine. In the corridor, the torches hissed. The guards did not speak. Even Varek seemed to sense that something dangerous had just changed shape. The king inhaled once, as if the answer cost him something. Then he said, "Because you were the only one who left water beside the furnace door after the curse took hold." My breath stopped. I had done that. Not for him, not then. I had not even known who I was helping. I had only seen a chained shadow in the half-dark, heard the crack of dry breathing, and set down what little I could spare. Once. Then again. Then many nights after that, when the watch changed, and no one looked too closely, I had carried water in an ash jar lid, and left it by the iron threshold, where someone always found it gone by morning. I had never seen who drank it. I had never been thanked. I had only known that the cups were emptied. "You knew," I whispered. "I knew someone was risking punishment to keep me alive," he said. His voice was so quiet that it almost hurt more than if he had shouted it. Not because it was grand, but because it was certain. The kind of certainty no one had ever given me about myself. Varek's face had become very still. Too still. Then he turned abruptly to the guards. "Enough. Take the prisoner to the furnace annex now. Double the watch. And if she touches any ash records, burn them." The king's answer was immediate. "No." The word did not roar. It did not need to. The air rippled with heat. The torches bent toward him as if bowing. The guards froze. Varek looked past me to the king with open anger now. "You cannot protect a maid from the council." The king's gaze was unblinking. "Watch me." And for one suspended moment, I thought he might break every chain in the corridor just to prove it. Instead, he did something more terrifying. He looked at me and asked, with complete gravity, "Era, do you want to stand trial in fire court and show them what the ash has been keeping?" The question hit harder than any accusation. Not command, not order. Choice. He was asking me whether I wanted to step into the very machinery that had crushed me and put my own hands on the lever. My heart hammered so violently I could feel it in my throat. If I said no, they would likely drag me there anyway. If I said yes, I would be walking into a room full of people who had spent years laughing while I bent over their floors. But I understood one thing now. My hands had been shaping the secret all along. My silence had not been empty. My ash had not been meaningless. I lifted my chin. Yes, I said. The corridor changed. Not because anyone cheered, not because anyone smiled, but because the king's flames, which had been licking restlessly under his skin, suddenly stilled. They did not flare. They bowed. And that frightened Lord Vorik more than any threat could have. For the first time since I had entered the cell, I saw a crack in the court's certainty. Saw it in the priest's pale mouth, in the guard's shifting boots, in the minister's eyes, as he realized the thing they had dragged into the dungeon was no longer simply a maid with soot on her sleeves. It was a witness. The king straightened, and the heat around him became thinner, sharper, almost disciplined. Then keep her alive until dawn, he said. Varik's mouth tightened. On what authority? The king smiled then, but there was no kindness in it. Only the promise of a fire that knew exactly where to burn. On the authority, he said, of the person you tried to erase. They did not take me through the main halls. That was the first mercy anyone in the palace had shown me, and it was not mercy at all. It was fear. Fear that if the servants saw me paraded in chains after the Fire King had bowed to my water, they might start asking the wrong questions. Fear that the story would spread before the council had finished inventing its lie. So they pushed me down the furnace passage instead, where the walls sweated heat and the stones were dark with old soot. 2 guards walked ahead, 2 behind, and between them I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Not because my wrists were bound, though they were. Not because my dress had been torn at the shoulder, though it had. It was the silence that made me feel small. The kind of silence that means a room has already decided what you are. Lord Varek rode with us on the lower step of the corridor, his boots striking the stone with calm, practiced impatience. He carried a lantern, even though the passage was already bright with furnace glow. I realized then that he liked to be seen carrying light, as if the act alone could make him a guardian instead of a man who had spent years feeding lies to the court. The king walked beside the guards with chains around his wrists and throat, but the chains were not pulling him anymore. They had gone slack after my cup of water, and every few steps the links trembled like they were uncertain whether they wanted to hold him or kneel. I kept my eyes forward. If I looked at him too long, I feared I would notice something worse than his power. I would notice that he was watching me with a patience that did not belong in a dungeon corridor. At the iron door of the furnace annex, Varek signaled the guards to stop. The room beyond was not a cell. It was a work chamber, long abandoned except for the ash troughs, broken tongs, and sealed record racks lined along one wall. I had scrubbed those racks 100 times, though no one had ever bothered to tell me what they were. They had always called it the Ash Annex because ashes came through there. To me, it had always been another place to kneel. Varek glanced at the racks and then at me. "Leave us," he said to the guards. One of them hesitated. "My lord, the king." "The king is bound," Varek snapped, "and the maid is not dangerous unless she can think. Keep watch at the door. His little laugh at the end was meant for the guards, but it landed on me like an old bruise. The door sealed with a final iron groan, and the room became a cage of orange light. The furnace wall breathed behind a grate in the floor. Heat climbed my throat. I could taste metal and old smoke. Varek removed his gloves very slowly. He always did everything slowly when he wanted others to feel helpless. It was a habit of men who mistook leisure for authority. Then he turned to me with his polite court face in place. "Era," he said, as if we were old acquaintances and not a minister, and the maid he had ordered hauled away. "You have caused an extraordinary disturbance." I said nothing. He smiled. "We are prepared to be charitable. If you admit that you were given a distillation by some outside hand, perhaps we can spare your life and simply cut the fingers that handled it." My stomach tightened, but I held his gaze. "What distillation?" I asked. The king's head turned at once, just a fraction. But he heard it too. Varek's smile sharpened. "There it is. That simple little game. You think ignorance makes you innocent. I think," I said carefully, "that if you needed poison, you would not be asking me. You would be hiding the body already." For the first time, something like surprise crossed his face. It lasted less than a breath, but I saw it. He recovered quickly. The water touched the king, and the flames bowed. There are only two explanations. Either the cup contained a binding reagent, or you have some hidden relation to his fire. Which is it? I looked at the king before I could stop myself. He did not answer for me. He only lifted his bound wrists a little, enough that the chains shivered, and said, "Answer honestly, Era. Not rescue, not command, permission." And somehow, that made my lungs ache more than the accusation. I swallowed. The water was water. Varek's eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, to the king, as if trying to catch a lie in his expression. But the king's face remained unreadable, carved from heat and patience. Then Varek moved to the record racks. The gesture was too smooth, too practiced. He placed one finger on the nearest sealed drawer and pulled it open with a snap of wax. Inside lay a stack of ashtrays, each no wider than a palm, each coated with thin black dust, pressed into deliberate patterns. My pulse stumbled. He had not brought me here to accuse me. He had brought me here to see whether I recognized something. "There," he said softly. "These are furnace residue trays, old ones. We keep them to compare slag, incident reports, and royal burn signatures. I wondered if your little servant hands had noticed anything in all your years of sweeping." I said nothing, but my eyes had already found the top tray. The ash on it was too neat to be accidental. Not a stain, not a spill. A pattern. A spiral interrupted by 3 short breaks, and then a sharp line that bent back on itself. My chest went cold. I knew that mark, not because I had been taught what it meant, because I had seen it before, on the floor of the East Furnace room, months ago, when I had thought a coal crack had split open strangely. I had brushed it away because that was what I was paid to do. I had brushed away a warning. Varek watched my face closely. "Oh," he murmured, "you do recognize it." The king took one step forward, and every guard outside the door must have felt it. Heat rolled through the room like a warning pulse. Varek did not look at him. He kept his eyes on me. "You've been cleaning these rooms for years," he said. "Tell me, Maid, do you know why the ashtrays are stored in locked racks instead of being dumped?" Do you know why the council audits the furnaces every season, and why no report ever reaches the lower staff? I looked at the next tray. Another pattern, not random. Repeated. Similar marks, but altered by tiny differences that made my scalp prickle. Someone had been pressing symbols into soot where only a scrubber would see them. Some were warnings, some were dates, some were names fragmented by heat. Names. My own breath seemed too loud. I had been so proud once of knowing how to make a floor shine clean that no one could tell where the coal ended and the stone began. I had never understood why the ash always seemed to settle in odd places, always near the furnace lips, always along the seams where the heat pulsed strongest. I had assumed it was only the palace being careless. Now I understood why the small dust lines had never truly washed away. They had been built to stay. The king's voice came low. "You altered the ash records." Varek laughed under his breath. "Altered? No. Preserved. The palace is built on old agreements. Some must be hidden to maintain stability." "That is not stability," the king said. "That is concealment." "From whom?" Varek spread his hands. "From the people who would panic if they knew how close their beloved furnace was to collapse. From the servants who would never understand the burden of governance." His gaze slid back to me, and I understood then that he was not only accusing me, he was testing whether I was still small enough to be frightened into silence. He had misjudged me, or maybe he had not. Maybe he had simply forgotten what happens when the overlooked person learns the floor they kneel on has been speaking all along. I stepped toward the rack before I could think better of it. The nearest guard outside the door banged once, startled, but Varek raised a hand, and he fell quiet again. His confidence returned so quickly it was almost comic. "Careful," he said. "You're approaching evidence, and evidence can be inconvenient." I ignored him and crouched by the tray. The ash was warm enough to sting my fingertips through the fabric of my torn glove. I traced the spiral, then the break, then the line that bent back. Not a sigil of blessing, not a curse in the common sense, a mark of rerouted flow. My mouth went dry. I had seen that exact break pattern in the old furnace vents by the cistern hall, where the palace used to collect rain runoff before the channels were sealed. I had spent 3 winters sweeping that hall because the ceiling dripped soot there every night. At the time, I had only noticed the ash because it was harder to lift. It never came free in a single stroke. It held together in layers, as if heat had pressed it into memory. Now the memory was coming back to me in pieces. The vents, the cistern, the sealed channels, and the king's fire. My throat tightened as the next connection struck. If the furnace ash was showing rerouted flow, then the palace had not merely been cleaning up after a curse. It had been managing one, shaping it, feeding it through hidden channels, which meant the Fire King's condition had not begun with him. It had been done to him. Varek saw the realization land. His expression changed in the smallest possible way. The tiny softening at the corners of his mouth disappeared. The man who had been performing civilized interest was gone, and in his place stood something much colder. "You understand enough now to become dangerous," he said quietly. I rose too quickly. "You poisoned him." He tilted his head. "Careful. Poison is such a crude word." The king's chains flared hot against the stone with a hiss. Not enough to break, enough to warn. Varek glanced at him and then back to me. "Let us be precise, Era. The king was afflicted during a ceremonial rain binding 12 years ago. There were failures. There was panic. There were choices made for the good of the realm. No, the king said. One word. And in it, I heard a rage held so tightly it had become almost holy. Varek's jaw tightened. You were not awake for enough of it to know the details. I know who was present, the king said. I know who sealed the chamber. I know who took the rain chain ledger. For a moment, Varek's face lost all warmth. Then he smiled again, and it was a smaller, crueler smile than before. Do you? He said. Then perhaps you also know why the chamber records were transferred into ashtrays, and why the lower staff were told never to look closely. My heartbeat thudded painfully. Ashtrays, not ledgers, not books. Ash. The thing I had been touching every day. The thing no one thought to steal from a maid. My mind raced through the years like a hand turning pages too quickly to read. The nights I had been told to stay late because the furnaces needed a careful sweep. The strange orders to empty only certain troughs. The one time I had found a thin metal filament in the soot near the cistern grate and had nearly thrown it out, only to be shouted at for being slow. The floor near the royal antechamber, where rainwater had once leaked and left a silver stain that was never repaired. And every time I had been told to keep my head down and my mouth shut. Because servants were supposed to see only what they were paid to see. But Ash remembered. It held the shape of heat. It held the violence of what passed through it. I looked up sharply. The Ash records are not just reports. They're a map. Varek did not answer. That was answer enough. The king's gaze cut to me, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I saw not just recognition there, but something like astonishment. You can read them, he said. It was not a question. I should have lied. Should have said I only guessed. Should have kept one thing hidden if I wanted to live. But the truth had already risen too far. Yes, I said, barely above a whisper. Not all of it, but enough. Varek took a step back, and I saw his certainty fracture. Not break. Fracture. Men like him did not lose power all at once. They lost the comfort of believing they were the only ones who knew the room. He recovered by force of habit. Then you will read for the council at dawn and tell them what we need you to tell them. I stared at him. He spoke as though he had just offered me food. The king's voice was very calm. And if she refuses? Varek looked at him with open contempt. Then she becomes part of the problem. I almost laughed, but the sound died before it formed. Part of the problem. That was how the court described anyone they intended to crush. A broken bracket, a failed seal, a piece to be removed. I touched the ashtray again, more carefully now, and my fingers came away dark with powder. There was something else in it, not just a mark, a residue of colored mineral, pale silver under the soot. I rubbed it between two fingers. The tiny grains sparkled faintly, even in the furnace light. Rain chain salt. My mouth went numb. That was the material used in the palace's water-binding lattice, the one everyone claimed had failed naturally years ago. I knew it because I had once been forced to scrub the spill from the south sluice after a ministerial procession. The salt did not belong in furnace ash, which meant it had been carried there, deliberately, hidden in the soot. The king's breath changed. He had seen my face change again, and his own attention sharpened. "What is it?" he asked. I lifted my hand so both of them could see the glittering grains. Varek went very still. For the first time, he did not speak over me. "It's rain-chain salt," I said. "This ash was used to hide evidence from the binding chamber." The room seemed to contract. Outside the door, a guard coughed nervously. Somewhere farther away, a furnace bell rang once, faint and hollow. The king looked at Varek with a quiet, lethal understanding. "You sealed the rain-chain ledger inside the furnaces," he said. Varek's eyes hardened. "I preserved the realm." "No," I said before I could lose my nerve. "You hid a theft." He turned to me slowly. "A maid should know her place." And there it was again. The old weapon, the one that had kept me bowed for years. But this time it landed differently, because I no longer believed the room belonged to him just because he spoke first. I stepped closer to the furnace grate. Heat flickered against my cheeks. I could feel the old ash records under my fingertips now, not as dust, but as testimony. "If the rain-chain salt is in the furnace ash," I said, thinking as I spoke, "then someone transferred it after the binding chamber failed. The ash pattern isn't a record of damage, it's a record of movement." The king's gaze fixed on me with fierce intensity. "Can you trace it?" he asked. My whole body tightened. The question was not merely whether I could read ashes. It was whether I could follow them through the palace's lies and point to the hand that moved them. I looked at the trays again, at the repeating spirals, at the broken line, at the places where one pattern had been smudged out and another pressed over it. "Yes," I said. Varek inhaled sharply, and I knew then that I had spoken too boldly for his liking. But before he could interrupt, the king did something unexpected. He bowed his head slightly. Not to Varek, to me. The motion was so small that anyone else might have missed it. I did not. My heart gave one stunned, painful beat. He was not surrendering. He was placing the room under my judgment. When he raised his eyes again, the fire in them was no longer wild. It was focused. Waiting. "Then we do this properly," he said. "We let the ash speak." Varek's voice sharpened. "You will do nothing. She will be searched, the records will be sealed, and by dawn she will confess to poisoning or she will hang beside the furnace doors." The king smiled with no humor at all. "You have already lost the room," he said. The words were soft. The furnace light flickered. And then, from somewhere deep in the wall, a sound came that none of us expected. A crack, not a collapse, not an explosion. A precise, tiny crack, like a seal loosening after years of pressure. All three of us turned toward the ash racks. One of the trays had shifted by the width of a finger. Behind it, in the darkness of the shelf, something pale reflected back the furnace light. Not metal. Glass. Varek saw it too, and for one naked instant, the mask slipped entirely off his face. There was something hidden behind the trays, something he had not meant for anyone to find. I took one step toward the rack, and the chains on the king's wrists suddenly sparked. Not burning. Answering. He looked at the hidden glint in the shelf, then at me, and his voice dropped to a rough whisper only I was meant to hear. "Era," he said, "whatever is back there, do not let him reach it before you do." I reached for the shelf before Varek could decide whether to stop me. The moment my fingers touched the edge of the rack, The hidden glass caught the furnace glow and flared pale gold. It was not a simple pane or vessel. It was a narrow case, thumb length and flat as a splintered window shard, sealed with black wax that had browned at the edges from heat. A thing meant to survive behind flame and never be noticed unless someone already knew where to look. Varek stepped in fast enough that his cloak snapped behind him. "Away from that!" he barked. But the king's chains gave a violent metallic hiss, and the air itself seemed to tighten around the sound. Varek froze for only a breath, and in that breath I saw what he had hidden from us. Fear. Not of the king, of what was inside the glass. I curled my hand around it anyway and pulled it free. The wax seal did not break. It had already cracked once, years ago perhaps, then been reheated and pressed shut again, as though someone had wanted the contents to be both preserved and forgotten. I turned it over in my palm. Soot had settled into the seams, but not ordinary soot. There were thin metallic grains embedded in it, bright as ground mirror. The king's voice reached me, low and rough. "Do not open it here." That alone told me enough to make my stomach drop. He knew what it was, and Varek had wanted to make sure I never found it. "What is it?" I asked. Varek answered too quickly. "A ruined archive scrap, broken furnace waste. Nothing that concerns you. Nothing that concerns you." I had heard those words all my life, spoken by people who believed hidden labor was the same as hidden worth. I turned the case again and looked at the soot around the seam. A pale line ran through it in a repeating curve, interrupted every few inches by little burned nodes. A map. Not of roads, of heat. The same kind of pattern I had seen in the ashtrays. My pulse sped up, and I suddenly understood why the king's flames had knelt when I gave him water. They had not merely recognized mercy. They had recognized the ash I carried on my hands, the ash that had been touching records no one else bothered to read. I looked at the case, then at the furnace wall behind the racks. "Move the trays," I said. Varek stared at me as if I had spoken in a language he no longer controlled. "You do not give commands here." The king did not look at him. His eyes stayed on me. "Do it," he said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. 2 guards at the door shifted, uncertain. The king's chains brightened, and a thin ribbon of fire licked up one link before bowing inward like a salute. Their courage failed visibly. One of them stepped forward and seized the tray nearest the hidden compartment. Then another. The ash racks scraped aside with a dry, awful sound, and the wall behind them appeared in full. There, set within the stone like an inset eye, was a second panel of glass. Larger, darker, and beneath it, pressed into the mortar in layers of old ash, were dozens of mirrored impressions, fingerprints, seal rings, furnace marks, and the pale outlines of something I had never seen preserved so carefully. Rain-chain salt, not scattered, stamped, repeated. The king inhaled sharply, and for the first time since I had met him, his expression lost its cruel stillness. Something old and furious surfaced there. "This," he said, "was hidden in my own furnace wall." Varek's jaw tightened. "Those are maintenance marks. You are seeing treason where there is none." I almost laughed at the insult of it. Maintenance marks were the lie people used when they wanted a worker's hands to remain stupid. But the ash had a memory, and mine had spent years learning to read it. I stepped closer to the wall, my fingers hovering over the mortar without touching, The marks were layered. Recent ash on top of older ash. Not one incident, but many. Repeated removals. Concealment. Replacement. Someone had been taking records out of the furnace chamber and sealing them back in under fresh soot. Someone had been using the ash itself as a lock. And someone had expected me never to notice because I was only the maid who swept. My throat tightened, not from grief now, but from the unbearable shape of the truth. All those years I had been told to hurry, to keep my head down, to empty the cinders, and never ask why the same corners of the annex kept getting blacker. All those years, I had thought I was cleaning waste. I was cleaning evidence. I looked over my shoulder at Varek. Who taught the furnace crew to smear salt over the lower seams? I asked. His face held for a moment too long before he answered. No one. You are inventing patterns to save yourself. There it was. Not denial. Panic. I turned back to the wall and traced the hidden impressions without touching them. The ash along the edge had been pressed in a spiral, then flatted by a hand with a heavy ring. The ring mark was familiar from the trays, a signet used in the fire ministries. I knew that shape. I had cleaned the residue off it 100 times. Minister Halvek. My stomach sank as the name formed in my mind, because I remembered his polished gloves and his smooth voice, and the way he always leaned back when the ash was discussed, as if dirt itself were beneath him. He had never looked at me directly. Yet now the print of his ring sat hidden in the wall like a wound that refused to close. I said his name aloud. The king's gaze sharpened. Varek took one step toward me. You have no proof. I lifted the little glass case. This seal was heated twice. The first break is older than the second. The first time it was opened, someone removed a page or a strip from inside. The second time, they returned something false. If I can read the ash around the seam, I can tell you who touched it last, and what they wanted hidden. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. Then Varek gave a short, bitter laugh. You? A maid? His contempt should have stung more than it did. I was too busy watching the king. He had gone utterly still, not stiff with pain. Focused. He was listening to me as though every word mattered more than the entire court combined. You said you can trace movement through ash, he said. Do it. My hands began to tremble, not from fear of the task, but from what it meant. If I named the wrong person, I would die as a liar. If I named the right one, the palace would rather burn than admit it. But the king's flames had bowed for me once already. He had not dragged me into this. He had asked. So I opened my palm beneath the ash seam and inhaled slowly. The old furnace dust was bitter, metallic, and wrong in a way my body knew before my mind did. Rain chain salt, charred cedar oil, a trace of ward resin used in upper chambers, then something thinner, sharper, a perfume note. Not court perfume, gown perfume, a noble woman's scent, sweet and expensive, clinging faintly beneath the soot like a lie beneath silk. My head lifted. The king saw the change in me at once. Who? He asked. I almost said the minister. But the ash was not done speaking. The perfume had been layered over a second set of marks, smaller and closer to the floor. Someone had knelt by the wall. Someone wearing soft shoes, not boots. Someone who had helped to lift the false panel after the minister's seal was set. A person from the inner court. a person trusted enough to move through sealed halls without question. My mouth went dry. Someone else was there, I said. Not just Halvek. Varek's face changed. One muscle in his jaw jumped once, violently. The king noticed it too. His eyes narrowed, and the furnace light deepened around him as if the room itself had drawn a breath. "Say the name," he said. I looked at Varek, and in his expression I finally understood the shape of the trap. He had not merely been protecting a secret. He had been making sure the blame for the curse could be placed somewhere convenient if the real story ever surfaced. A maid. A fool. A body to hang beside the furnace doors. My fingers tightened around the glass case. The ash on the seam showed me one more thing, and it struck so hard I nearly stepped back. Water stains. Not fresh. Old. Repeated. Someone had been feeding the furnace wall water in tiny, measured drops. Not enough to cleanse it. Only enough to keep the hidden records from burning completely when the chamber ran hot. I thought of the cup I had lifted to the king's cracked mouth. I thought of how the flames had knelt. And suddenly, the impossible seemed less like a miracle and more like a recognition I had spent years unknowingly preparing for. The king spoke before I could. "You kept it alive," he said, and he was not speaking to the wall. He was speaking to me. The words landed with such force that my eyes burned. All my life, I had been called useless for the same hands that were now proving the kingdom wrong. I had been told Ash was dead, only for the dead to remember everything. Varek recovered first. "This is madness. She is manipulating your condition with whatever poison she gave you. You should not listen to her." The king's stare moved to him like a blade turning. "She gave me water," he said. Varek's mouth snapped shut. The king continued, voice colder now. And the flames bowed. "If that is poison, then tell me why every ward in this room reacted to her, and none of your lies did." I saw the guards exchange glances. I saw doubt begin to spread through the room like heat through dry straw. That doubt would not save me for long. But it was enough. The king turned back to me, and in that look, there was a warning and something else I had no name for yet. "This compartment is the first of many," he said. "If you are right, then someone has been rewriting my curse from inside the palace itself." I swallowed. "Then we need the other ash racks," I said. Varek's answer came like a knife drawn halfway from a sheath. "You will get nothing else before the trial." He gestured sharply, and two guards moved at once, not toward him, but toward me. I stepped back, glass case clutched to my chest, while the king's chains erupted with a burst of sparks, so sudden, the nearest guard cried out and stumbled. The king rose as far as the shackles allowed, and for the first time the room felt how enormous his restraint had been. "Touch her," he said quietly, "and you will learn what my flames do to men who mistake silence for surrender." The guards stopped. Varek's face drained of color. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt the floor shift beneath me, because in that moment, I knew the truth had grown teeth. This was no longer about one cup of water. It was about a hidden machinery of ash, salt, perfume, and seals that had been grinding inside the palace for years. And if I opened the wrong rack at the wrong time, every mocker in this court would rather see me buried than be forced to admit what I had found. The king's voice lowered until only I could hear it. "Era," he said. If you keep reading, they will call it theft before they call it truth. I met his eyes. They already have. For the first time, his expression softened, not enough for the room to notice, but enough for me to feel it, like a hand bracing mine in the dark. Then the furnace wall gave a faint, answering crack, and from deep behind the hidden glass, something inside the sealed chamber shifted, as if another record had just turned itself toward the light. The shift was so small that anyone else might have missed it. But I had spent years learning the language of burnt things, and the walls of the furnace annex did not move unless something sealed behind them had been disturbed. The king noticed too. His head lifted a fraction, and the chains at his wrists gave a low metallic groan, as if they could feel it before we did. Varek took one step back. "What did you do?" he snapped at me. Too fast, too sharp, because fear always makes liars louder before it makes them honest. I tightened my grip on the glass archive. Nothing. That sound came from behind the wall. That is exactly what someone says after tampering with evidence. Then why are you staring at the furnace like it might confess? The king asked. The room went still. Varek's face hardened, but I saw the crack beneath it now. He knew what was there. Not all of it, perhaps, but enough to fear it. One of the guards glanced toward the wall and then away, as if even looking too long might make him guilty by association. That was when I realized the palace had taught everyone the same lesson. Never question what the ash hides, because ash is supposed to be the end of things. It was never supposed to remember. I knelt beside the open trays and laid the glass fragment on the floor. The soot inside it was layered, older at the back, fresher near the edge, and beneath the black I could still see a pale salt line bent in a repeated curve. Not decoration, a chain pattern. Rain chain workmanship. The same curve had been stamped into the archived furnace wall records. The same curve had been hidden in the ash I cleaned every morning. And now, seeing it in the glass, I understood what I had only felt before. Someone had not merely cursed the king. They had rerouted the kingdom's protection around him and then called the ruin natural. My throat tightened. They stole from the rain chains, I said softly. Varek barked a laugh that sounded more desperate than amused. Listen to yourself. A maid with soot under her nails thinks she can read history. I looked up at him. No. I think history has been written by people who expected maids not to notice the missing pieces. That landed harder than I expected. One of the junior scribes lowered his eyes. Another guard shifted his weight. They knew that tone. They knew it because it sounded too much like truth. The king's flames, which had been restless since the chamber shifted, began to move in a different pattern. Not wild, not hungry, focused. They curled low around his shackles, then extended outward, not toward the guards, but toward me. A hush passed through the room. I felt every eye on my back, the same eyes that had watched me trip over ash buckets and call me stupid for smelling of smoke. The same eyes that had laughed when I came away from the furnaces black to the elbows. Now all of them were looking at the one thing they had always ignored. My hands. Hands that had swept the right corners. Hands that had noticed the wrong seal on the wrong tray. Hands that had carried water to a chained king when everyone else chose spectacle. The king spoke quietly. Read it. Varek threw up a hand. You cannot allow this. She is delusional. Read it, the king repeated. And this time, The word wasn't a request. I pressed my palm to the ash beneath the tray. It was warm, but not fresh. The cooling layer held the faintest ripple mark, the kind left when a seal is pressed and lifted quickly before the heat can blur it. I dragged a finger through the edge, then paused where the ash resisted. Beneath it, a thin line of pale mineral remained. Water salt. Collected intentionally. Preserved intentionally. Hidden in the furnace wall records, because only someone in the cleaning rotation would ever notice a dampness that did not belong. My breath hitched. The curse was layered over a warding lattice. It was not only fire magic. It was made with rain-chain salt and an oath mark. Someone broke the support seal first, then let the king's flame bind back on itself. The junior scribe looked at Varek. So did the guard. So did I. Varek's jaw flexed. "You are improvising?" "No," I said. "I'm remembering every furnace I scrubbed for 3 years. The wall did not stain like ordinary soot. It repeated in sections. Someone preserved the pattern because they needed the Maid root to carry the evidence for them. That made the room colder than any winter draft, because now even the guards understood the insult of it. Not just that I had been used, that I had been useful and unseen at the same time. The king's gaze moved to me, and in it I saw the thing I had been afraid to name before. He had not only recognized me at the brazier, he had been waiting for me. Not as a savior, not as a chosen bride from some court tale, but as the only person who had been walking past the hidden truth every day without being paid to worship it. He said, low enough that it felt meant for my heartbeat alone, "You kept the record alive." My fingers curled in ash. I only cleaned. "No," he said. "You preserved what they tried to erase." I should not have looked at him when he said it. I should not have let that warmth reach me. But I had lived too long being told I was nothing to resist the first person who named the exact shape of my work. Varek saw that moment and understood he was losing the room. He turned sharply and pointed at me. "She is confessing to conspiracy. By her own words, she admits she handled the wards." I straightened. "I admit I handled ash. You were counting on that, remember? Ash passes through your hands, your sleeves, your shoes, and your lies think no one will notice." Then I reached into the second glass fragment and pulled free the thin bonded strip hidden inside its curve. It was no larger than a fingernail, but the soot stains had protected it. I laid it on my palm and read the mark engraved beneath the char. A sigil of the ministerial seal. Not Halvek's alone. Someone from the inner court had worn it. A woman's perfume trace clung to the resin. The same rare resin the court seamstresses used to keep heat out of their gloves. At that, every head in the chamber began to turn toward the side entrance. Lady Maris entered, as if she had always intended to arrive at that exact moment, her pale ceremonial robe immaculate, her expression composed in the way only guilty people can manage when they have rehearsed innocence for years. She was not old enough to be harmless. She was not young enough to be naive. She was the sort of woman who survived by standing close to power and calling it duty. Her eyes found the fragment in my hand, and for the first time her composure slipped. The king's flames lifted, not toward me, toward her. They arched high, then stopped, trembling at the edge of her robe as if they knew her, as if they had always known her. The room erupted in whispers. "No, Maris said too quickly. "This is a trap. She planted it." I shook my head. No one plants old ash under a furnace wall and forgets how the pattern repeats. The king's voice was ice over coals. "Maris, come closer." Her chin lifted, but her feet did not move. For the first time, I saw it clearly. The court had not only hidden the curse, it had built the lie around someone they trusted to carry messages, key seals, and inspection passes. The palace had not needed a monster to explain the king's agony. It had needed a maid like me to make the evidence disappear. And now the evidence had chosen to speak. Maris's mouth opened, but before she could answer, the furnace wall cracked open along its seam with a thunderous groan of stone and iron. A recessed chamber slid into view behind the ash stacks, and inside it, row after row of sealed testimony tablets glimmered in the heat. My knees nearly gave out. All those years, all that sweeping, all those missed glances and bruised wrists and orders to move faster because I was only a maid. I had been standing on top of a graveyard of proof. The king's chain strained suddenly, then fell slack with a sound so soft it hardly seemed real. One by one, the links cooled. The flames around them bent inward and sank, not dying, but kneeling. The court fell silent. Not because they had repented, because they had finally been forced to witness what mercy had done. The king rose, and this time the fire did not lash out at him. It gathered around his shoulders like a banner that had remembered its true bearer. He looked at Maris, then at Varek, then at the people who had spent years pretending his suffering was a necessary order of things. Then he turned to me. I braced for a command, for a demand, for the kind of ownership the court always called protection when it belonged to someone powerful. Instead, he asked, very clearly, "Era Cinderwell, do you want me to burn them now?" The question struck harder than any shout, because he was asking me, not the council, not the guards. Me. I looked at the ash, at the tablets, at the woman who had helped bury the truth, at Varek, pale now and stripped bare by his own fear, at the king, who had every reason to rule by fire and chose, at the final moment, to place the choice in my hands. I thought of every time I had been told to stay small. I thought of every mocked apology I had swallowed. I thought of the cup of water, and how one forbidden kindness had turned the whole court upside down. "No," I said at last, my voice shaking but clear. "Not burn them. Make them watch." The king's mouth curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something warmer and far more dangerous to everyone in this room. "As you wish," he said. And when he lifted his hand, the flames did not strike. They opened the sealed chamber instead, pulled every tablet into the light, and branded the guilty seals one by one so the whole court could read the names they had tried to hide. Maris went white. Varek stumbled backward. And for the first time in years, no one in that palace could pretend the ash had been silent. It had been speaking for me all along. If you want the next part of this kind of story, stay with me, because the cruelest people always panic right before the truth reaches the throne.